Hi quilters, welcome to the 9th video in our series to use leftover 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. For this pattern, you will need 36 strips that are 2.5 inches by 21 inches of a dark and 36 strips that are 2.5 inches by 21 inches of a light. I've measured out some painter's tape to 21.5 inches so I can easily see if my leftover strips are long enough. If I have a full strip of fabric, I can simply cut it on the fold to get 2 strips that are 2.5 inches by 21.5 inches. And yes, my rotary cutter is open. I better close that so I don't cut myself or leave it in a place where it can cut somebody else. Of course, you can just use the measurements on the mat instead of the tape. I just find it easier to use the center of the mat instead of the very edge. Now that I found all the dark strips, I'm going to work on the light strips. For both the light and dark, I'm trying to find a variety of patterns, shades of color, and size of prints. You need variety to give the eye more to see, or what I like to call sparkle in a quilt. We did a survey in our Facebook group page on which color combo to do for this video. The choices were green and cream or black and hot pink. The winner was obviously green and cream. Next month's video will feature the black and hot pink. We will put out more surveys, so check the group to see what kind of questions we have for you. The name of this pattern is Quadrangle. The link to the pattern is in the description below. I have some great tips and tricks for you in this video, so keep on watching. 2 other fabrics are needed for this quilt top. One is an accent cornerstone fabric, and the other is a background fabric. I've chosen a dark green for my accent cornerstones, and I will need a fat eighth of this fabric. I'm using 2 scrap pieces that equal a fat eighth of fabric. You need to cut 5 strips that are 1.5 inches by 21.5 inches. From these strips, you will need to subcut 36 squares 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches for the block centers and 25 squares 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches for the cornerstones for a total of 61 squares. I've chosen to use the same fabric for all of my cornerstones, but these could also be cut from scraps. For my cornerstones, I have chosen the same color as I used for the dark fabric. Although if you wanted to, you could use a totally different fabric for a little pop of color. I think this pattern is perfect for a 2-color quilt. It could work with any combination. I could also see it in red and cream, blue and white, purple and white, lime green with a black background. So many different possibilities. Just pick 2 colors with a lot of contrast. The other fabric you need is a background fabric. You will need 2.5 yards, and it will be used for all of the setting, sashing pieces, and for the outer border. I do recommend just using 1 fabric for the background to give the quilt some continuity. From the background fabric, you need to cut 3 strips that are 9.5 inches by the width of fabric. If you're enjoying our series of quilts using 2.5-inch strips that are left over from other projects, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to see more videos in the future. You also need to cut 5 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. These 5 strips will be used for the block sashing. You will also need to cut 7 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. These will be used for the border. I usually wait to cut the border pieces until I'm ready to sew them on. It allows me to make the border smaller or larger if needed, and gives me a chance to make the quilt larger or smaller with pieced blocks if I want to change the size. From the 3 strips that are 9.5 inches by the width of fabric, subcut a total of 60 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 9.5 inches. These will be used for the sashing between the blocks. From the remainder of this fabric, you need to cut as many 1.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles as you can for the leftovers. These will be used when you're piecing the blocks. Make sure to double check that you have cut 60 rectangles 1.5 by 9.5. I'm always double checking my work because I don't want to make any mistakes. The other bonus part about cutting the border strips later is that if I've made a mistake in cutting these pieces, I can always cut from that to get the pieces I need. From the strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of fabric, you need to subcut rectangles that measure 1.5 by 4.5 inches. When you have an odd number of strips to cut through, instead of having 3 strips in one pile and 2 strips in the other pile, split the last strip on the fold and put half in each pile. That way the ruler will lay flat and not be slightly tilted when you're cutting, and the cuts will be more accurate. For the quilt top, you will need a total of 144 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I like to use my large square ruler to make these cuts because then I can start at the 12-inch marking and then cut backwards. So I've got the 12-inch marking, 10.5, 9-inch, 7.5, 6-inch, 4.5, 3-inch, and 1.5. That way I don't have to move the fabric or the ruler as much as usual. Once the cutting is done, it's time to move to the sewing machine to start piecing. We're going to be using 1/4-inch seam allowances throughout the quilt top. Most of my strips are pretty flat, but I'm going to iron the ones that need a little help. Otherwise, I'm just going to start sewing my strips together. Each dark strip gets sewn to a light strip. You have 36 dark strips and 36 light strips, and we'll end up with 36 strip sets that are light and dark. This is the kind of mindless sewing that I love to do, where I just pick up 2 different strips and sew them together. I didn't really pay too much attention to which 2 fabrics I was sewing together, as long as one was light and one was green. Once you've sewn all 36 strip sets, it's time to cut them apart and then take them to the ironing board. The Blade Saver thread cutter makes quick work of cutting those threads between the strips. This little tool has become one of my favorites, and it has saved me a lot of time. Now it's time to press. I will usually put 2 strips sets on the ironing board at the same time, kind of an easy way for me to set things up. I press them flat first, and then I open them up and press towards the dark fabric. Pressing them flat first will set the seam and of course straighten the fabric. If your fabric needs some help to lay flat, you can always use a little bit of best press spray. Once you're done pressing, it's time to head to the cutting mat to subcut the strip sets. I'm going to guide you through 3 different ways that you could cut these strip sets. Use the method that works the best for the way that you sew. The first method I'm going to show you is to cut 1 strip set at a time. You're going to cut this in half so you have 2 pieces of the same strip set. You're going to lay 1 strip set on top of the other so that light to dark on both sides, so the seam will kind of nest there in the middle. And then you're going to cut sections that are 2.5 inches wide from this piece. I like to use my square ruler so I can cut at the 10-inch mark, the 7.5-inch mark, the 5-inch mark, and the 2.5-inch mark. And then my 4-patch units are all ready to sew. Seam is nested together, and all I have to do is take them to the sewing machine. The only downside is I just have to do 1 at a time, so it takes a little longer. The way I really like to cut, though, is to line up several strip sets at once and cut through all of the layers at once. 2 things you need to remember if you're going to use this method is to line those up as squarely as you can to get accurate cuts, and then make sure your rotary cutter is very sharp to go through all the layers. And lastly, double check every time you cut to make sure that you have the right measurement, because if you make 1 mistake, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. For this one, you're subcutting 8 sections that are 2.5 inches wide. You will match these up later when you get to the sewing machine. You'll match up your 4 patches to each other. The bonus of doing this method is the cutting can go so much faster than doing 1 strip set at a time. The final method for cutting strip sets is just to do one strip set at a time, and for beginners this might be the best method because if you make a mistake you're only going to ruin one strip set, and if you are uncomfortable with cutting through many layers, this makes it much easier to get your strip sets cut. Each method has its benefits and you need to use the one that is best for you. Once all your strip sets are cut apart, it's time to head to the sewing machine to make 4-patch units. From each strip set, you cut 8 2.5-inch wide segments. You will join 2 segments to make a 4-patch unit. From each strip set, you should have 4 matching 4 patches. If you use the first method for cutting, all you have to do is pick up your units and sew them together. If you use the last method to cut your sections out, put 4 in one pile and 4 in another pile, match them up so that the seams will nest together, and then send them through the machine. I usually put the pile on the left right side up and the pile on the right side down. Then I just have to nest them together at the center and send them through the machine. If you use the cutting method where you cut multiple layers at a time, you just have to match your pieces before you send them through the machine. I'm pretty careful about keeping my stacks together, so it's usually not hard. I just have one side that I have the light up and the other side where I have the dark up. That way they're easier to grab and I just go down through the stack. I think it's really fun to watch the pile behind the sewing machine getting higher and higher. Looks pretty cool. Once you've sewn all the 4-patch units, it's time to get the Blade Saver thread cutter out and make quick work of cutting them all apart. If your Blade Saver seems to be getting dull, don't forget to turn the pedal to find a new spot to do the cutting. Now it's time to head to the ironing board to press all the 4-patch units. I pressed all of my 4-patch units to one side, but you could also press the seam open from the back. So back to when we cut and sew these together, if you have all 4 of your pieces together, it's easy to match up the 4 matching 4 patches. But if you did the part where you sew stacks at a time, then it'll be a little trickier to get all of these 4-patch units matched up to each other. I just spread them out on my ironing board, and then when I had a stack of 4, I moved it to a different area so it wouldn't distract me from finding my other matches. Once you're all done with the pressing, it's time to head back to the sewing machine to make the blocks. You will need all of the background 1.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles and 36 of the 1.5-inch by 1.5-inch cornerstone squares. Lay out 4 matching 4 patches, 4 sashing strips, the 1.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles, and 1 square 1.5 by 1.5 in the center. Make sure that the dark squares of the 4-patch units form an X. Piece these units together to make 3 rows. When I was putting these blocks together, I usually worked on 1 or 2 at a time just to keep things together and so I didn't have pieces spread out and have to match them later on. I send the parts through the machine and then I would cut them off on the back side, lay them out where they're supposed to be, and then I would attach the next piece that goes onto them until I had the whole row sewn across. Once I have the whole row sewn all the way across, I lay out the next block and then I start sewing on that one. When I'm sewing the 3 rows through the machine, I keep them together so I won't break the thread in between so that the 3 rows are still attached to each other when I take them off the machine. Once you get 2 or 3 blocks sewn, then it's time to head to the ironing board to press. For all 3 rows of each block, press towards the sashing fabric. You can press from the front side or the back side, whichever you prefer. Once the rows are pressed, head back to the sewing machine to put the rows together into a block. The seams in the center with the cornerstone will nest together, and that will help you piece your block. As you're sewing the rows together, make sure that the dark fabric is closest to that cornerstone in the middle to make sure that the block will still look like an X when you're done. If you want to, you can press before you add the second half of the block to the sashing center. Just make sure that the dark parts of the 4 patches are closest to that center square. When you're done sewing the block, the dark parts of the 4 patches should form an X. To complete the block, press the seam towards the sashing row in the center. The block should measure 9.5 inches by 9.5 inches. Make 36 blocks. For this step, I found it easiest to start from the back side and press the seams first from the back side, and then I used a little bit of Mary Ellen's Best Press spray to make sure the block laid extra flat. I'm glad that I picked every shade of green to use and used a bunch of different backgrounds on here just to give the quilt a little bit of movement, make your eye go all around the quilt to see all the different colors. Split the blocks into 6 piles of 6 blocks. I tried to make sure that each pile had light greens and dark greens and, of course, different backgrounds. Each pile of 6 blocks will need 5 of the sashing rectangles that measure 1.5 inches by 9.5 inches. Now that everything is sorted out, I'm just going to sew on one pile at a time. First, you will piece the sashing rectangles to 5 of the blocks, and then as you're sewing through the machine, cut them off on the back side and then start sewing them together so that the sashing rectangles are between the 6 blocks. I didn't really pay much attention to which blocks I were sewing together. I just wanted to have 6 blocks with 5 sashing pieces in between. When I sewed the blocks to each other after I got the sashing piece on the first one, the only thing I wish I would have paid more attention to was making sure that when I matched up the block to the next one, that the sashing from the block matched up with the one that it was going into. Sometimes they were a little bit off, and while I didn't notice it until I was putting the rows together, I wish I would have pinned at this point to make sure they lined up a little bit more perfectly. Since this quilt is just for fun, I decided to not let it bother me and just to keep sewing instead of starting to rip things out. But if you have something you want to watch for, that would be the thing to pin. I have noticed one thing, that as quilters, we like to point our mistakes out to other people. And sometimes I will notice a mistake in someone else's quilt, but I'm certainly not going to tell them about it unless they're asking my opinion. And there's the galloping horse rule. If you wouldn't notice a mistake if you run by the quilt on a galloping horse, then the mistake doesn't exist. So you can use that to your advantage. Today, on this quilt, the galloping horse rule lives. Once you have all 5 of the sashing strips sewn between the 6 blocks, then it's time to press. You want to press towards the sashing fabric. I found it easiest just to work on one row at a time. The rows should measure 59.5 inches long. This is the point where I wish I would have pinned to make sure those matched up, but again, I'm just going to be on that galloping horse and not even notice. Put together 6 rows of 6 blocks. Now that all the rows are made, we can make the sashing rows. Each of the sashing rows are made with 6 of the 1.5 inch by 9.5 inch rectangles of the background fabric and 5 of the squares that are 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch. I made one row at a time and pressed away from the cornerstones or towards the sashing and added it to the quilt top on the floor as I got them done. These rows will also measure 59.5 inches long. Make 5 of these sashing rows to go between the 6 block rows. Once all the rows are made, start sewing them together in pairs, a sashing row to a block row. Press after every time you sew, always press towards the sashing row. When you're finished putting your quilt top together, it should measure 59.5 by 59.5. Piece all your border strips that are 4.5 inches wide, end to end, and then cut your border strips from those. Measure your quilt top, cut 2 of the border strips to make that same measurement, and sew them to the top and bottom of the quilt. Measure your quilt length, and cut 2 strips of your border fabric that are the same as that measurement and sew them onto the sides of the quilt. Find a batting and a backing piece that's big enough for your quilt top. Layer them together and quilt as desired. I put mine on my long arm quilting machine and quilted it in a simple loop pattern with a soft colored cream thread. The pattern calls for 5/8 of a yard for a binding fabric, but of course, since I'm trying to get rid of all my 2.5-inch strips, I piece strips together in all sorts of different lengths to get a strip long enough that would go all the way around the quilt. I used my diagonal seam tape to help me sew the line from corner to corner to get that diagonal line on the binding strips. The diagonal seam tape has been a game changer for me to get these binding strips to lay nice and flat. Trim away the excess fabric. You want to have a 1/4-inch seam allowance. The diagonal seam on the binding will help spread out the bulk of the seam for a flatter, bump-free binding. When pressing your binding, always press with the seams open. That will also help spread the bulk of the seam. Attach the binding to the quilt top and you're done. The simple 4-patch block is stunning. It makes me think of a single Irish chain block quilt. The different darks and lights really make the quilt sparkle. Simple loop quilting and a scrappy binding finish it off perfectly. Now I just need to find my lint brush so I can get all the loose threads off of there. For the backing, I just used a soft pale green fabric that had little tiny cows and pigs on it. The perfect fabric for an Iowa farm girl. While I didn't use all of the greens and creams that I started out with, I made a serious dent in the pile. The before and after pictures of my scrap bins don't look too different from each other, but I can definitely tell a little bit of a difference. I'll take it, that's for sure. It would probably go down faster if I didn't keep adding about this many strips every week or so. We hope you want to hit that like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!